Okay, so today we're going to look at the Roaring Twenties, which is the period right after World War One. And after that, being involved in that big conflict, Americans take this tone of like, let's be isolationists again, let's withdraw into ourselves. And this also gave a rise again to this nativist movement, this fear of foreigners coming over and bringing revolutions like what happened in Russia. So we see another rise of native and anti-foreigner campaigns in the United States. And this leads to what we call the first Red Scare. There's two Red Scares that we talk about in American history. There's one in the 20s, and we deal mostly with foreigners and immigration. And then there's one with the 50s, which is about Cold War spies and stuff. People felt like all these immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, some of them could be Russians, and they had a revolution there, and they're going to bring their revolution over here. And we need to keep an eye out for these immigrants and keep them out of the country if we can. So Attorney General Palmer comes up with this idea that there's going to be a plot to overthrow the United States, and it's coming through foreigners. And so he conducts a series of raids known as the Palmer raids into immigrant communities and just started rounding them up in their homes. He went to areas where there was a lot of immigrants living and just started rounding them up and started deporting them, some, without any evidence, and some of them being citizens. And this is something we'll see happen again and again in U.S. history. Another example of the anxiety against foreigners at the time is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested for a murder and a robbery, and with really shaky evidence, they are convicted. Now, one of the main arguments used in the trial isn't really that here's the evidence they committed a murder, they committed a robbery. It's that they were foreigners, and foreigners were criminals. It's it's an argument and equation that we still hear to this day. So they were just literally indicted for being foreigners. And this just shows, the atmosphere of the time period. And at the same time, as part of this rise of anti-foreign sentiment, nativist sentiment, we see another surge of the Ku Klux Klan. And the resurgence of the Klan comes for, not just because of the Red Scare and his nativist sentiment, but at the same time, and we see them emerge in reaction to African Americans starting to organize themselves, especially after World War I, to fight for civil rights. Because they're like, we served our country, we should have our rights. Like we bled for this country, we should have our rights. And so there's this huge resurgence in the KKK to answer this, to put them down. There are stories of veterans, trying to show up to vote and being killed, or veterans daring to walk down the street. African American veterans daring to walk down the street in their uniform and being beat to death by the KKK or lynched by the KKK. And this is just a resurgence, because people were trying to use their military service to elevate themselves to have, full citizenship rights. The KKK, came back to show them, where their place was in the South. During the 20s, we have a series of Republican presidents that kind of follow the same Republican model we see most Republicans follow. And, this group is Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. They promote high protective tariffs, which always end up hurting, the economy, because if you raise tariffs on imports, they're going to raise tariffs on our goods, and then it shrinks our market. Lower taxes, saying that if we tax the rich less, then the money will trickle down, and it never really does. And once again, we return to this laissez-faire attitude toward business, no regulation. They stop busting, monopolies and just let them do what they want to do. And a very anti-union sentiment. During the Harding presidency, he runs on this idea that return to normalcy, war is over, let's just concentrate on domestic policies, and we don't have to worry about the international affairs anymore, let's just fix America. But, in fixing, in running as this return to normalcy, also the normal thing is, political corruption. One of the first major scandals in Washington takes place under Harding's term, and it is known as a Teapot Dome scandal. Basically, members of his cabinet were selling federally protected lands to oil companies in exchange for a little kickback, some money, some bribes. And because of this laissez-faire attitude and less control of the market and stuff, we see this huge boom in the economy of the United States, which will be, but it's really built on a house of cards, which just comes crashing down within a decade. And some of the things that fueled this prosperity at the time is the creation of the assembly line and the rise of the use of automobiles. And we get all kinds of new innovations. But one thing that they just lean on so much, and this is where the pseudo prosperity emerges, is this easy credit that eventually comes. The bill eventually comes due in 1929. Now, the assembly line did a lot of things for especially for cars, made it more efficient to manufacture cars. You can make them faster. You can make a lot more. And what Henry Ford, though, on top of the assembly line, he started to look and realize like he's not selling as many cars as he's able to produce. So Henry Ford starts to like take a look at his workers, and he realizes something. Most of his workers don't drive to work because they can't afford a car. And that's when it dawned on him that if, is he just making a good that can only be bought by a certain percentage of the Americans? Or does he want a good that can be bought by most Americans? Because that's just more money for him, more business. So he takes a look at the situation and he does two things. One, because mass production allows him to lower prices on the vehicles, he also increases the wages in his workers so that they can then afford cars. And what he does is he spurs this increase in wages in other places because, otherwise they're going to lose workers to Henry Ford's factories. Now, in the lecture when I was talking about railroads, and I talked about the huge impact of railroads, when we look at the rise of automobiles in America, automobiles like one of the many symbols that if foreigners think of America, it's usually cowboys and cars that come into their mind. And cars have become so synonymous with America, but because they have such huge impacts on the American lifestyle and economy and where you live and everything. Because if you think about it, like, I said, trains could get goods everywhere. Cars can also do that. And then cars allow people to not even have to live close to where they work. So we see the emergence of suburbs, people living outside the city instead of living in the city because they can now drive to work. And this also increases like family vacations because now you don't have to go get a train ticket. You can just drive anywhere. And when people start to, this creates this tourism industry, and this whole industry on the road. So you have the boom of gas stations, hotels, resorts. Think about going to like Disneyland and all these resort destinations are because people just can easily pack up in their car and just drive anywhere. So all these industries and hotels and restaurants and things are boom because of this ability for people to move and go to different places. And so whatever the railroads did, the cars did times 10. And this is really, the major impact of the automobile on society, especially American society. Now, other innovations start to emerge at this time, like appliances that you see normally in the household, or start to appear like electric, refrigerators, toasters, all these household consumer goods, all being bought on credit. We also see different forms of transportation booming, not just cars, but subways and trolleys. And then we have Glenn Curtiss starting to mass produce aircraft using the same kind of ideas as the assembly line. And slowly you see a fledgling airline industry. And as people are buying, because the United States is a consumer economy, and as long as they're buying, the economy is doing good. So we have all these people going out and purchasing stuff. Even if they can't afford it, they start to take loans to buy these things. They take loans to buy houses. They take loans to buy all these things. And instead of like checking credit or checking this or can you really afford it, banks were more than happy to lend all this stuff out. But all this, like I said, in the end, the bill comes due. People even start to take loans to buy stocks. So we call it buying on the margins. So it's like fake money on top of fake money. And eventually the house of cards comes collapsing. And what we see also in what this leads to, like I said, in 1929 is this, all this mass consuming of things that people can't afford. This is, causing, a boom in manufacturing and stuff like this because they're producing all these things that people are buying. And so when the stock market crashes in 29, not only does it hurt the buyers, it hurts the workers who are producing the things that they're buying. So this is all going to lead to the stock market crash in 1929. Now we're going to look at also in the 20s, there was this huge struggle between traditional and modern values, like conservative and, and more liberal values, old school versus new school. We see it play itself out in the society, in issues in society in the American 20s. One of the first big moves I spoke a little bit about in the progressive era is prohibition. Many women's groups have been pushing for the end of alcohol, the end of sale of alcohol, making alcohol illegal. They saw alcohol as the major problem in society because men would get drunk and they'd spend all their check in the bars, or they come home drunk and they would beat people, beat their families, beat their wives, beat their kids. And like, well, if we just get rid of alcohol, we'll fix this stuff. And so the 18th Amendment is passed, and it prohibits the sale of alcohol. Now, one of the things about alcohol, Mike, like any other drug that people lean on, those drugs are just symptoms of a bigger disease. There's something else wrong with society, like dealing with the uncertainty of work and other things. And so these things are just like, symptoms. They're not the actual disease. And another thing, when it comes to something that people want so much, they're still going to get it. And so, we go from legal sales of alcohol to illegal sales of alcohol. And this is what fuels the creation of the mob. The mafia wouldn't be anything if it wasn't for prohibition. If we can't buy it at the store, well, the mafia will provide it. And they get it from different places, like Canada, like Mexico. And people would also produce like bathtub gin literally in their bathtubs. It didn't taste so well. So this is actually where cocktails are invented. They started to add juices and stuff to make it taste good. It was not a law that a lot of people enforced. Heck, the president had a liquor cabinet. Most law enforcement looked the other way unless there was like a gang war. Then they did their best to settle that. But what we really see is just the rise of crime, and with the 18th Amendment, and it eventually has to be repealed. So it just the idea of banning alcohol would fix America's problems. Just created a whole bunch of more problems. And so they eventually had to repeal it, and the 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment, and liquor is legal again. And this is also a really good example of how we can, people's voice in democracy. If they want, we can have an amendment, or we can repeal an amendment if we want to. Another example of this culture clash is what is referred to as the Scopes Monkey Trial of 1925. And it was a kind of like a battle between, the new sciences coming in and religion. Science, since the scientific revolution, had been slowly starting to answer the questions that religion once answered. Most people only understood what the world around them through the lens of the supernatural. And now here comes science demonstrating or answering some of those questions. And so this all comes to head when John Scopes is a biology teacher. He decides, even though the school says he can't, to teach Darwin's theory of evolution because everybody's teaching it. His idea is like, well, the kids are going to hear this in college. They might as well, be ready for it. And he is fired. He's jailed. And so this becomes what they call the trial of the century at the time. The two best lawyers in America, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, argue for and against this. John Scopes is actually, found guilty, but this brings the argument to light. Like all the press from all the world comes down and looks at it, kind of looks at America being backwards, like you're fighting the teaching of science. And it really made a lot of people in the United States like come to think about like, how are people viewing us? And also like, shouldn't we be teaching science, the real science that everybody is teaching everywhere? And so, but this was a demonstration of the clash of old and new. And as part of this whole wave of nativism, there's a lot more immigration restrictions being placed on immigrants that can come to Europe. They place immigration quotas. And really the quotas are to keep out parts of Europe that they don't like the Eastern Europe. Remember the old and new immigrants? They don't like the new immigrants from Eastern Europe. These are the people that say are causing problems, bringing crime. They're not desirable. So they start to reduce the amount of immigrants that can come from those areas. And here you can see first it's Northwestern Europe and then slowly Southeastern Europe. And then, then this is like the new immigrants and slowly the backlash to get rid of those new immigrants. And you can see the pie graph shifted way back to mostly immigrants from northwestern Europe. Another pseudoscience that emerges at the time, we talked a little bit about social Darwinism. This gives birth to this junk science known as eugenics. And what the idea was that we needed to purify the race, that if mixing with races was just going to make the Anglo race weak, and we had to purify the races. And they would do this by introducing laws about like anti-marriage, like a white and a black cannot marry, segregation laws, forced sterilization. This is all in the belief to make a better society. And this is where, the Nazis get it from and ramp it up in Germany. But the ideas and the concepts and the practices actually start in the United States. And it was never a way that Charles Darwin meant his theories to be applied at all. It was just something people ran with. It's something that justified their beliefs is what it was. Their beliefs that they were superior. And then we also see a big cultural change and movement of peoples in the 1920s. Look at women in the 20s are the women that come out after they get suffrage, and they start to feel a little bit more freedom now that they have suffrage, and they want to push the envelope and demonstrate how much freedom they have. Society has told them for so long how to act, how to dress, what jobs they should have, and they want the freedom to be doing those choices on their own, like any man. So, some of the things that they did was the way they dressed and acted. You're like, you're not going to dictate how we wear our hair. We can cut our hair short. We can wear short skirts. We can wear what we want. We will not be dictated by society. And the women around this time who would dress like this and act like this were known as flappers because the way their dresses would flap around when they were dancing. And what they were dancing to is the next part. There was a lot of jazz clubs and all this swing and stuff making its way into the north, but its roots are coming from the south. In the Great Migration in 1910, 1930, basically what's happening is a lot of African Americans are escaping the South. They're escaping the violence of segregation, the fear, and they're looking for greater opportunities. So they flee from the South and they go up north to seek work in the factories and live in areas where it's predominantly African American. And we start to see, some African Americans draining out of the South, so much so that plantation owners in the South actually would beat up people that came to recruit workers to go up north. A lot of these workers had to sneak off in the middle of the night to get off the plantation to go up north just so they could, get away and get freedom and look for jobs, which is really reminiscent of the Underground Railroad. And what happens is they settle in communities like in Harlem, New York. And in Harlem, you got to understand what these people felt when they got to Harlem. They come from a white-dominated world where they had to get off the sidewalk if a white person's walking on it. And they go into a world where all the businesses are owned by African Americans. You have African American bankers, African American lawyers, store owners, newspapers. And they finally felt free. This was America was supposed to be like. And they brought a lot of their culture with them. And they started, writing all kinds of poetry and books that they could never have written and published in the South. And this is known as the Harlem Renaissance. They finally felt this burst of freedom. So there's also this burst of the arts that they can now, share with each other and literally share with the world, because they had all these clubs, and white people would slowly sneak into these clubs as they really liked the music. And it kind of just started to bridge that gap between the races. And this Harlem Renaissance, this burst of freedom is like, shouldn't we all have it all over the United States? And this is some of the many seeds that go to the growing civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. And during that time period, because aviation starts to boom, there's this big hero named Charles Lindbergh, who's the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And he becomes a big hero because he does that. It turns out later that he's a really big follower of eugenics. And when the Nazi Party rises, he has a secret Nazi family. He's also famous because his little boy gets kidnapped. They ask for a ransom, and he tries to pay it. And then they find a little boy he had actually been killed. And there are rumors nowadays that he was heavily involved in it and maybe have orchestrated that whole affair because his son had rickets and one leg was shorter than the other. And like I said, he was a staunch believer in eugenics, and that would make him impure in the eyes of people that believe in eugenics. And because of this huge resurgence of the KKK and stuff like that, you also have people wondering, is America a place for African Americans? And people like Marcus Garvey was a political activist, was all about racial pride, said, you know what, we might just have to just get out of this country and start all over again in Africa. And this creates what they call the Back to Africa movement.